8-year-old Clara holds a secret heavier than most adults can bear. Her world shifts when a mysterious woman steps off the train, silent, armed, yet full of resolve. Watch how a girl, a father, and a woman without a voice learn to trust, protect, and heal each other in the unforgiving West. Through Clara's eyes, we see that empathy and patience are as powerful as any weapon. Don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe for more emotional journeys across the prairie.
The train hissed like a dying beast. Steam rolled thick over the wooden platform of Millhaven, Montana. It was April in the year 1878, but out here, April wasn't spring. Not really. It was just winter catching its breath. Abigail Prescott stepped down from the final rail car. She didn't look like a bride. There were no heavy steamer trunks, no velvet ribbons, no nervous, blushing smiles. Just a 26-year-old woman in a faded gray wool skirt. Her face was gaunt. Her eyes were sharp. They swept the platform, checking the exits, weighing the shadows. Her hands were entirely empty of luggage. She carried only 3 things to her name: a silver ring on her left hand, a small leather notebook tucked inside her coat pocket, and a Winchester, model 1873 rifle, slung heavy over her right shoulder. Across the platform, Nathaniel Thorne stood waiting. Nate, 38 years old. He leaned against a wooden post, hat pulled low. He had the tired, weathered face of a man who had seen too much blood in a war long past and too much quiet in the years since. Beside him stood Clara, 8 years old, arms crossed tight against her chest. Stubborn. She didn't want a new mother. She was perfectly fine with just her father and the prairie. Nate watched the passengers thin out. He was looking for a mail-order bride. He expected a frightened, delicate thing from the east, someone he would have to shield from the wind. Then the steam cleared. He saw Abby. He saw the frayed hem of her skirt. He saw the cold, vigilant set of her jaw. And he saw the cold steel of the Winchester. Most men would have frozen. Most men would have tipped their hats, turned on their heels, and left her standing there. A woman with a rifle was trouble. A woman with a rifle meant danger. Nate didn't turn away. He took a slow breath. He let his eyes meet hers. He didn't look at the gun. He looked at the woman carrying it. He saw the exhaustion. But beneath it, he saw the iron. This wasn't a fragile flower. This was a survivor. A slow, quiet smile broke across Nate's weathered face. "Perfect," he murmured. He pushed off the post. He walked toward her, his boots heavy on the wooden planks. Clara trailed behind him, her eyes wide, staring dead at the gun. "Miss Prescott," Nate said. He tipped his hat. "I'm Nate Thorne. This is Clara." Abby didn't smile. She didn't nod. She just looked at him for a long, heavy second. Then she reached into her wool coat. She pulled out the small notebook. A page out one she had written long before the train ever stopped. She handed it to him. Nate took it. He read the neat black ink. "I bring no dowry. I have no voice. I only have this rifle and the grit not to run away. If you need an obedient maid, you chose the wrong woman." Nate read it twice. He didn't look shocked. He didn't look with pity. He just folded the paper, nice and neat, and tucked it into his vest pocket. "The wagon's out front," he said. That was it. No questions about her voice. No demands for a dowry. He turned and led the way, fell into step behind him. For the first time in 7 years, someone didn't demand an apology for who she was. 10 minutes later, they were out of town. The Montana prairie opened up around them. Endless, brutal, beautifully cinematic under the pale gray sky. They sat in silence. The wagon wheels crunched over the hard earth. Sat in the back. But she wasn't looking at the mountains. She was staring at the front seat. She couldn't take her eyes off the Winchester resting across Abby's lap. The little girl was tense, scared. She pulled her knees to her chest, treating Abby like a wild animal that might snap. Nate saw it. He felt the tension radiating from the back of the wagon. He didn't just let it slide. He didn't hope Clara would just figure it out over time. He pulled back on the leather reins. The horses slowed to a halt. The prairie went dead quiet. Nate turned around in his seat. He looked Clara dead in the eye. His voice was deep, steady, and left no room for argument. "Clara, listen to me," Nate said. "Do not look at her as a threat. Here in Montana, a woman carrying a rifle isn't looking for a fight. She is a woman who understands the greatest of human rights, the right to defend one's own life when the law is too far away." Nate paused. He pointed a calloused finger toward the vast, empty land around them. "Out here, survival isn't just for men. No one has the right to demand a woman lay down and be helpless. Carrying that rifle means she values her own life. It means she protects herself. And in this world, that right belongs to a woman just as much as any man. You remember that. You respect that." Clara blinked. She looked at her father. Then, slowly, she looked at Abby. The fear in the little girl's eyes faded. It shifted into something else. Something like awe. Abby sat completely still. Her knuckles were white where she gripped the rifle stock. She stared straight ahead at the horizon. Her throat felt tight. No one had ever said those words to her. No one had ever told her that fighting to live was a right, not a sin. Nate clicked his tongue. He flicked the reins. The wagon lurched forward again, rolling deeper into the wild country. Abby didn't have a voice. But as she watched the snow-capped mountains rise in the distance, she realized something. She might not need to shout in this place. For the first time in a very long time, she was heard. The cold woke her, sharp, bitter. It crept through the gaps in the floorboards. Abby opened her eyes. The room was dark. A thin sliver of gray light hung at the window. Morning came hard in Montana. It didn't warm the earth. It just made the frost visible. She didn't stay in bed. 7 years on the run taught her better. You don't linger. You don't get soft. She dressed quickly. Her fingers were stiff. She pulled on her faded gray wool skirt, laced her worn leather boots. She picked up the Winchester, the metal. It was freezing. It felt right up like reality. She stepped out of her room. The house was quiet. Just the low crackle of dying embers in the hearth. Nate was already gone. The man worked before the sun cared to show up. Abby pushed the heavy front door open. The air hit her lungs like cracked glass. The prairie stretched out in every direction. Endless, beautiful, terrifying. The sky was the color of bruised iron. Out here, you were nothing. Just a speck of dust on Goddess' big coat. She walked toward the barn. The snow crunched under her boots, a steady, rhythmic sound. The barn doors were cracked open. Inside, it smelled of sweet hay, old leather, manure, and sweat. It was warm. The kind of warmth that comes from living, breathing things huddled together. She walked down the dirt aisle. The horses nickered, low, soft sounds. At the end of the row, she found him, a big roan gelding, older. His coat was rough. He stood in the corner of his stall, favoring his left hind leg. He was trembling. Abby stopped. She didn't raise her hand. She didn't step toward him. She just stood by the wooden gate, breathing, letting him know she was there. Animals understood trauma. They didn't ask questions. They just smelled the fear on you. If you were calm, they were calm. Abby slowly leaned her rifle against the stall. She unlatched the gate. The click was loud. The horse pinned his ears back. The white of his eyes flashed. He tossed his head, warning her, "Stay back. I hurt. I will kick." Abby didn't retreat, but she didn't rush. She lowered her shoulders. She made herself small. She kept her eyes averted, staring at his knees. Slowly, she extended one hand, palm up flat, empty. She waited. 1 minute passed. 2. The cold air hung between them. The horse let out a long breath. His nostrils flared. He took half a step forward. He stretched his heavy neck. His velvet nose bumped her open palm. He exhaled warm air against her frozen skin. Abby moved her hand, just an inch. Her fingertips brushed the rough hair of his jaw. Slow, steady, rhythmic, up to his neck, down to his shoulder. The horse lowered his head. He closed his eyes. The trembling stopped. He usually bites. The voice was small, coming from the shadows. Abby didn't flinch. She just turned her head. Clara was sitting on an overturned bucket near the tack room. Her knees pulled up to her chest. She was watching Abby with wide, serious eyes. Pa, says Copper, is just mean now, Clara said. Says the pain made him mean. No one can touch that bad leg. Abby looked at the girl. Then she looked at the horse. She tapped her own chest. Then she tapped Copper's neck. She made a smooth downward motion with both hands. Calm. She pointed to the horse's injured leg. She pointed to her own knee. She made a face, grimacing. She clenched her fists. Pain. Then she opened her hands, pushing them out toward Clara, like pushing away a wall. Fear. Clara watched, her brow furrowed. The gears were turning in that 8-year-old head. He's not mean, Clara whispered. He's just scared because it hurts, and when you're scared, you fight. Abby nodded, a slow, deliberate nod. Clara stood up. She walked over to the stall. She stood next to Abby. She looked at Abby's hands. Show me, Clara said. Abby smiled, just a fraction, but was there. She took Clara's small, cold hand. She guided it, showed her the flat palm, the slow approach. They stood there for an hour, no words spoken, just the rustle of hay, the breathing of the horse, the movement of hands. They were building a bridge, one gesture at a time, a language that didn't require a voice. Just attention, just patience. That evening, the kitchen was warm. The iron stove radiated heat. Abby had cooked stew, venison, potatoes, carrots. Simple, heavy, the kind of food that kept you alive in the winter. They sat at the wooden table. The lanterns cast long, dancing shadows on the walls. Clara was chattering, telling Nate about the barn, about the frost, about Copper. Nate listened. He nodded. He ate his stew, but his eyes weren't on Clara. His eyes were on Abby. Nate was a rancher now, but he used to be a surgeon. He spent 4 years putting men back together in tents that smelled of gangrene and despair. He knew the human body. He knew how it worked. Every muscle, every tendon, every nerve. He watched Abby eat. He watched the way she swallowed. He watched the movement of her throat, the subtle flex of her jaw. The mechanics were perfect, flawless. There was no paralysis, no severed nerves. Her vocal cords were intact. She wasn't physically mute. Nate set his spoon down. The clink was loud in the quiet kitchen. Abby froze. Her eyes darted toward him. Vigilance returned instantly. The wall went back up. She stopped chewing. Nate didn't push. He didn't demand an answer. He knew better. He reached into his vest. He pulled out a small piece of charcoal and a scrap of thick brown paper. He smoothed the paper out on the table. He began to write. His handwriting was sharp, precise. A Dr. S. hand. Abby watched the charcoal scratch against the paper. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Did he know? Was he angry? Was he sending her back? Nate finished writing. He didn't look at her with pity. He didn't look at her like she was broken. He slid the paper across the rough wood of the table. It stopped right next to her bowl. Abby looked down. She read the words. They anchored her to the floor. When the mind witnesses something beyond endurance, It slams doors shut to protect whatever pieces of the soul remain. I've seen able-bodied soldiers who couldn't walk. Your silence is a shield, Abby, not a disability. I respect that shield. Abby read it again. The letters blurred. Her throat tightened. A hard, painful ache. For 7 years, people had looked at her like she was defective, like a broken clock, something to be pitied, something to be fixed, or ignored entirely. Nate didn't want to fix her. He saw the armor she wore, and he told her it was okay to wear it. Abby slowly reached out. She traced her fingers over the charcoal letters. The dust smeared onto her skin. She looked up at Nate. Nate picked up his spoon. He went back to his stew. He didn't make a grand gesture. He just gave her the truth, and he let her keep her dignity. Abby took a breath, a deep, shaking breath. She picked up her spoon. She ate the rest of her meal in silence. But for the first time, the silence didn't feel heavy. It felt safe. The wind howled off the mountains. It rattled the window panes. It was mid-morning. The sun was pale and distant. Nate stood on the back porch, sipping black coffee from a tin cup. He was looking at a row of tin cans up on a log fence 50 yards away. Out here, everyone knows how, Nate said. He was looking at Clara, but he was talking to Abby. Clara stood in the dirt, bundled in a heavy wool coat. She looked nervous. Abby stood behind her. She had the Winchester in her hands. The law is a 3-day ride from here, Nate continued. His voice was flat, pragmatic. I can't always be at the house. If something comes up the trail that shouldn't, she needs to know what to do, not to hunt, to live. Abby nodded. She understood. More than he knew. She stepped closer to Clara. She didn't use sign language right now. This required touch. She knelt in the dirt. She handed the heavy rifle to the little girl. Clara gasped slightly as the weight transferred to her arms. It was too long for her to, but she had to learn the feel of it. Abby placed Clara's left hand under the forestock. She moved her right hand to the grip. She kept Clara's index finger straight, pointing along the frame, not on the trigger. Never on the trigger until you were ready. Abby tapped her own chest. She took a deep breath, puffing her ribs out. She let it out slow. Clara watched. She mimicked the breath. In, out. Abby moved behind her. She placed her hands over Clara's. She helped support the weight of the barrel. She guided the brass butt plate snug into the pocket of Clara's shoulder. Abby pointed to the front sight, then to the tin can. She tapped Clara's temple. Focus. Clara nodded. Her small face was set in grim determination. Abby tapped Clara's trigger finger. She guided it inside the guard. She rested it on the cold curve of the trigger. She didn't let Clara pull. She pressed her own finger over Clara. Slow. Squeeze. Don't jerk. Just apply pressure. Like wringing out a sponge. The rifle fired. The crack split the quiet morning. The recoil pushed Clara back, but Abby was there, solid as a wall, catching the impact. 50 yards away, the middle tin can spun off the log into the tall grass. Clara gasped. The smell of sulfur hung in the air. The gun smoked in her hands. She lowered it. She turned around. Her eyes were huge. Then a massive grin broke across her face. Abby smiled back. A real smile. It touched her eyes. She patted Clara's shoulder. Good job. Nate watched from the porch. He took another slow sip of his coffee. He didn't cheer. He just nodded. It was a good shot. It was a good teacher. By late afternoon, the wind died down. A buckboard wagon rattled up the dirt drive. Martha Higgins, the widow from the next spread over 50 years old, built like a brick oven. Warm, unstoppable, loud. She brought a dried apple pie. She brought news from town. She brought noise into the quiet house. They sat in the sitting room. The fire cracked in the stone hearth. Martha talked a mile a minute. About the weather, about the sheriff, about the price of feed. Abby listened, pouring coffee. She liked Martha. Martha didn't talk at her. She just talked around her, letting Abby be part of the room without demanding a toll. Nate sat in the leather chair near the fire. He had the Winchester across his lap. He was cleaning it. A rag, some oil, a ramrod. It was a soldier's habit. You take care of your gear takes care of you. He rubbed the oiled cloth down the octagonal barrel. The blued steel gleamed. He wiped the brass receiver. Then, he moved to the wooden stock. The walnut was worn smooth from years of handling. He flipped the gun over to oil the other side. He stopped. His thumb froze over the wood. Near the butt plate, scratched crudely into the walnut with a knife, was a name. Silas Miller. Nate Tess' breath caught. Just for a second. The name hit him like a physical blow. He wasn't a lawman, but he read the papers. Years ago, 1871, there was a story out of Kansas. A gang of 3 men, bushwhackers, animals. They hit a farmhouse, butchered a family. But the leader didn't make it out. Silas Miller. The paper said he was shot in the chest at close range. The only survivor of the house was a 19-year-old girl. She'd disappeared right after, taking the dead man's gun. Nate looked up, slowly. Abby was holding the coffee pot. She wasn't pouring. She was staring at Nate. She saw where his eyes had stopped. She saw the recognition dawn on his face. The coffee pot rattled against the tin cup. Her hands were shaking. Martha stopped talking. She looked at Abby, then she looked at Nate. The silence in the room suddenly turned suffocating. Abby set the coffee pot down. It landed hard on the wooden table. She backed up a step. Her heart pounded in her ears. This is, she thought, this is where it ends. She wasn't a poor, helpless victim. She was a killer. She had blood on her hands. Silas Miller's blood. When people found that out, they always got that look. Disgust. Fear. They didn't want a woman who knew how to pull a trigger on a man. She reached into her pocket. Her fingers fumbled. She pulled out the leather notebook. She pulled out her stub of pencil. She walked over to the table. She pressed hard. The pencil lead nearly snapped. She wrote the truth. No dressing it up. No hiding. It was his gun. He killed my father. He killed my mother. I hid in the cellar. When he came down to look for me, I took it. I shot him. I didn't hesitate. I killed him. She ripped the page out. The sound of the tearing paper was violently loud. She shoved it across the table toward Nate. She stepped back again. Her chin went up. Her shoulders squared. She braced herself for the dismissal, for the order to pack her things. Nate picked up the paper. He read it. He didn't blink. He didn't react. Martha leaned over. She read the scrawled handwriting. Martha stood up. The chair scraped against the floor. Abby flinched, but Martha didn't back away. She walked straight over to Abby. She reached out with both hands. Thick, strong, flour-dusted hands. She grabbed Abby's cold, shaking fingers. She held them tight. Nate stood up. He set the paper on the mantel. He set the rifle next to it. He looked at Abby. He saw the terror behind her defiance. He saw the years of running, the years of carrying that guilt like a stone around her neck. Nate stepped toward her. He spoke. His voice was a low rumble. It wasn't angry. It was absolute. "Listen to me, Abby," Nate said. The words cut through the room like an axe through soft wood. No one, not God nor any jury, has the right to demand a woman lay down and accept a death. What you did that night wasn't a crime, Abby. It was the most sacred instinct of survival. Abby stared at him. Her breathing hitched. Nate took another step. He didn't touch her. He just held her gaze, making sure she heard every single syllable. Making sure she understood it wasn't just comfort. It was the absolute truth. You didn't murder a man. You executed a monster who came to butcher you. You fought for your life. Don't you ever let anyone make you feel guilty for staying alive. A tear broke loose, hot, fast. It tracked down Abby's cheek. She tried to wipe it away, but Martha held her hands tight. Martha squeezed them. "He's right, honey," Martha whispered. "You lived. That's all that matters. You lived." Nate turned around. He picked up the oiled cloth. He picked up the Winchester. He went back to cleaning it, treating it with respect, not like a murder weapon, like a tool that had done its job. "I'll have to sand that name off the stock," Nate said casually, not looking up. "No sense carrying another man's garbage in your hands. We'll carve your initials in it tomorrow." Abby stood there, surrounded by the smell of wood smoke, coffee, and gunning oil. She wasn't going back on the train. She wasn't being cast out into the cold. She squeezed Martha's hands back. She closed her eyes. For the first since times that night in Kansas, the ghost of Silas Miller let go of her throat. Spring in Montana didn't arrive with gentle breezes. It came with mud, heavy, clinging, knee-deep mud. The snowmelt turned the prairie into a swamp. But the work didn't care about the mud. The fences needed mending. Winter was hard on the timber, harder on the wire. Nate was out by the southern boundary. He had 3 hands with him, good men, hard workers. One of them was Elias, young, maybe 20, built like a whip and twice as fast. They were stretching wire, the new stuff, barbed, mean as a cornered wildcat. You had to pull it taut, tight as a fiddle string. If you didn't, the cattle would push right through it. Elias was on the come-along tool, cranking the lever, pulling the wire tight against the locust post. The metal groaned, the tension built. "One more clicky," Nate called out. He was holding the hammer, ready to drive the heavy iron staple home. Elias leaned into it. He cranked. The tool slipped. The metal teeth let go. The wire snapped back. It sounded like a gunshot. A sharp, violent crack that echoed off the mountains. Elias screamed. He fell back into the mud. He clutched his left arm. The wire had whipped across his forearm. It didn't just cut, it tore. The barbs ripped through the canvas jacket, through the flannel shirt, right down to the meat. Nate dropped the hammer. He ran. He hit the mud beside Elias. He pulled the boy's right hand away. The blood was bright. Too bright. It was pooling fast in the cold mud. "Tourniquet," Nate barked. He was already pulling off his leather belt. "Hold still, Eli. Hold still." He wrapped the belt above the elbow. He pulled it tight. The bleeding slowed. But the cut was bad, deep, jagged. It needed cleaning. It needed stitching. Right now. "Get him in the wagon," Nate ordered the other men. "Get him to the house." They drove fast. The wagon bounced over the ruts. Elias was pale, shivering. Shock was setting in. Abby was on the porch when they pulled up. She saw the blood. She didn't scream. She didn't put her hands to her mouth. She just turned and pushed the front door open wide. "Kitchen table," Nate shouted. They carried Elias inside. They laid him on the heavy oak table. "Abby, boil water. Get the carbolic acid from the cabinet and my black bag." Nate's voice was sharp, a commander on a battlefield. Abby moved, fast, efficient. She stoked the stove. She put the kettle on. She fetched the leather medical bag from the high shelf in the study. She set it on the table beside Nate. Nate opened the bag. The smell hit him first, old leather, dried iodine, copper. It was the smell of the tents. He reached in. He pulled out the needle, the catgut thread, the steel forceps. He looked down at Elias. The boy's face was slick with cold sweat. His eyes were rolling back. The blood was smeared across the table. So much blood. Nate raised his hands to thread the needle. His fingers trembled. Just a little at first. A fine vibration, like a plucked string. He clamped his jaw. He tried to force his hands still. He focused on the eye of the needle. He brought the thread toward it. His hand jerked. The thread missed. The tremor moved up his wrists, up his forearms. His breathing went shallow. The kitchen began to shrink. The walls closed in. It wasn't April, it was July. It wasn't Montana, it was Pennsylvania, Gettysburg. 1863. The air was heavy, thick with the smell of gangrene and black powder. The screaming, dear God, the screaming never stopped. It echoed in his ears, hundreds of men, torn apart, begging for water, begging for their mothers, begging for death. Nate looked at the table. He didn't see Elias anymore. He saw Matt, his twin brother, lying on the bloody canvas cot, pale, dying, a piece of shrapnel in his gut, looking up at Nate with terrified eyes. Trusting him. Fix me, Nate. You're the doctor. Fix me. Nate's hands shook violently now. He dropped the forceps. They clattered loudly on the wooden floor. He couldn't breathe. There was no air in the room. Just smoke. Just death. He backed away from the table. He hit the wall. He slid down, his hands clutching his own hair. He pulled his knees up. He was a 38-year-old man, a seasoned veteran, shrinking into the corner of his own kitchen. Elias moaned on the table. The belt was holding the worst of the bleeding, but the wound was open. It was getting dirty. Abby stood by the stove. The kettle whistled. She turned. She saw Nate on the floor. She saw the absolute terror in his eyes. He wasn't looking at the kitchen. He was looking at hell. She didn't run to him. She didn't shake him. She knew what a ghost looked like when it took hold of a person. You couldn't fight a ghost with panic. She walked over to the wash basin. She poured the boiling water. She added the cold pump water. She washed her hands with lye soap, thoroughly, deliberately. She walked to the table. She picked up the forceps from the floor. She dropped them in the boiling water to clean them. She took out a fresh needle from the bag. She threaded the catgut, first try. Her hands were stone. She looked down at Elias. She tapped his cheek. Once, twice, firmly. Elias opened his eyes. He looked at her. Abby put her hand on his good shoulder. She pressed down, a grounding weight. I am here. You are here. Hold still. She poured the diluted carbolic acid over the wound. Elias screamed and thrashed. The other ranch hands held him down. Abby didn't flinch. She took the needle. She pinched the torn flesh together. She pushed the needle through. A clean, perfect stitch. She tied it off, snipped the gut, moved to the next one. Her movements were rhythmic, a seamstress mending a heavy coat. But this coat bled. Nate sat against the wall, his chest heaving. He watched her. He watched a woman who had lost everything, a woman who couldn't speak, put a broken man back together. She didn't hesitate. She didn't shake. She just did the work. 20 minutes later, the wound was closed, bandaged tight with clean white linen. He needs to sleep, Nate whispered. His voice was hoarse, broken. Put him in the bunkhouse. Keep him warm. Give him water if he wakes. The men carried Elias out. The kitchen was empty, just Nate on the floor and Abby standing by the bloody table. She looked at him. She didn't look with pity. She didn't look with judgment. She walked over to the sink. She washed the blood from her hands. She dried them on a towel. Then she walked out the back door. She left him alone. Because she knew, better than anyone, that sometimes you just need to sit in the dark until the ghosts go back to sleep. Night fell hard. The wind howled down from the peaks. It rattled the windows. Nate sat on the back porch. The air was freezing, but he didn't wear a coat. He held a glass of dark amber whiskey. He didn't drink it. He just held it. The porch door creaked open. Abby stepped out. She held a heavy wool blanket. She walked over to him. She didn't ask. She just draped the blanket over his shoulders. She sat down on the wooden bench beside him. They sat in the dark, The stars were sharp and cold above them. Nate took a breath. The air burned his lungs. His name was Matt, Nate said. The words hung in the frigid air. Abby turned her head. She looked at his profile, jaw clenched, eyes staring out into the black prairie. My brother, Nate continued. His voice was flat. Empty? My twin. He took a sip of the whiskey. It burned going down. It didn't help. 1863. Gettysburg. It was July. Hot. The air felt like breathing water. I was a surgeon for the Union. I was good, Abby. I was fast. You had to be fast. If you were slow, they died of shock. If you were dirty, they died of rot. He stared at the glass in his hand. They brought him in on the second day. Artillery shell. Shrapnel in his abdomen. It was bad. But I fixed worse. I knew I could fix him. I just had to get the metal out. Stop the bleeding. Stitch the bowel. Nate's hand started to shake again. The whiskey sloshed against the rim of the glass. I put him on the table. I told him he was going to be fine. I promised him. He was looking at me, just trusting me. Nate closed his eyes. I picked up the scalpel, and I looked down, and it wasn't a soldier anymore. It was my brother. It was my own face looking back at me, and I froze. He let out a ragged breath, a sound like a dying animal. My hands started to shake. I couldn't hold the blade straight. Every time I tried to cut, I terrified myself. I was so scared of killing him. I couldn't save him. Another surgeon had to push me out of the way. But by then, he's lost too much blood. He died on that table while I stood in the corner, shaking. Nate turned his head. He looked at Abby. His eyes were red, hollow. I buried him. I buried my medical bag. I came out here. I couldn't save my own blood. I have no right to cut into another living thing ever again. He looked away, ashamed, waiting for her to stand up, waiting for her to walk inside and leave a coward to the cold. Abby didn't move. She sat completely still for a long moment, taking in the weight of his confession, the crushing, suffocating guilt he had carried for 15 years. She stood up, but she didn't go to the door. She reached into her pocket. She pulled out her leather notebook. She pulled out her pencil. She knelt in front of him on the hard porch boards. She held the book in the moonlight. She began to write. She didn't write fast. She pressed the pencil down hard. The lead dug into the paper. She carved the words into the page. When she was finished, she ripped the page out. She stood up. She held the paper out to him. Nate looked at it. He shook his head. Abby, I don't want to read platitudes. I don't want you to tell me it was God's will. Abby's eyes flashed. Angry. Fierce. She stepped closer. She shoved the paper into his chest. Hard. Nate took it. He looked down at the words in the pale moonlight. He read them silently. Abby reached out. She tapped the paper. Then she pointed to his mouth. Nate frowned. I read it. Abby shook her head violently. She tapped at the paper again. She pointed to his mouth. She tapped her own ear. Read it out loud. Abby, please. She didn't back down. She stood over him, small, frail, but possessing a gravity that held him in his chair. She tapped the paper a third time. She wasn't asking. She was demanding. Nate swallowed hard. His throat was tight. He looked at the paper. He looked at her handwriting, steady, unbroken. He opened his mouth. He forced his voice to work. You didn't fail because you were a poor surgeon. Nate read. His voice cracked on the first sentence. He stopped. He tried to take a breath. Abby tapped his knee. Keep going. Nate gripped the paper. His knuckles turned white. He read the next line into the cold Montana night. You failed because you were a flesh and blood human being trying to operate on the heart of your own family. The words hit the air. They sounded different spoken aloud. They didn't sound like excuses. They sounded like a diagnosis. Nate stared at the page, his vision blurred. He forced himself to finish the paragraph. He had to say the words. She was making him hear his own pardon. The psychological wounds of soldiers do not vanish when the guns fall silent. Nate read aloud, his voice trembling now, but not his hands. You need to forgive the doctor you were that day, for he did everything he humanly could. Nate stopped reading. The silence rushed back in. But it wasn't a punishing silence anymore. He let the paper drop to his lap. He looked up at Abby. She wasn't looking at him with pity. She was looking at him with absolute solidarity. She was a soldier, too. She had her own ghosts. She had her own shaking hands. And she knew that the only way to survive the trauma was to stop punishing yourself for having it. Nate leaned forward. He rested his elbows on his knees. He buried his face in his large, calloused hands. He didn't sob. He didn't wail, but his shoulders shook. A quiet, heavy release. 15 years of carrying a corpse on his back. 15 years of hating the hands that had failed him. Abby stepped forward. She didn't pull him into a hug. She didn't offer empty comfort. She simply rested her hand on the back of his neck. Her fingers were warm, grounding. She stood there in the freezing night, holding the weight of his grief with him, letting him break, letting him finally put the burden down. The wind continued to howl across the prairie. The frost settled on the porch railing. But for the first time since the war ended, Nathaniel Thorne felt the bleeding stop. The hayloft smelled of dry grass and old dust. It was quiet up there, just the wind scraping against the shingled roof. Clara sat cross-legged on a bale of hay. She was holding a piece of rough twine, tying knots, untying them, tying them again. Her hands were restless. Her mind was loud. Abby sat across from her. The afternoon sun cut through the slats in the barn wall, painting golden stripes across her lap. She had a heavy canvas grain sack over her knees. She was pulling a thick iron needle through the fabric. Mending a tear, pull, loop, tighten. It was a steady rhythm. Clara watched the needle. She liked watching Abby work. Abby never rushed. Abby never made sudden movements, and Abby never lied. That was the thing about grown-ups. They lied all the time. They lied with their smile, with their promises. They lied when they said everything was going to be fine. But Abby didn't have a voice to lie with. Her hands only told the truth. Clara dropped the piece of twine. It fell into the loose hay. She looked at Abby. She raised her small hands. She took her right thumb. She placed it against her chin. Fingers spread wide. It was the sign they had agreed on. Abby stopped sewing. The needle hovered above the canvas. She looked up. Her dark eyes locked onto Clara. She gave a small, slow nod. Clara swallowed hard. Her throat felt tight, like she had swallowed a stone. She raised her hands again. She tapped her forehead with her middle finger. Sick. Then Clara shook her head, violently, side to side. No, not sick. Abby set the grain sack aside. She didn't lean forward. She didn't try to touch the girl. She just gave her complete, unbroken attention, the kind of attention that said, I am here. I am listening. Take your time. Clara's hands started to shake. She made the sign for night, a hand moving over the other, covering the sun. Then she brought her two fists together. She moved them in a circle, like the wheels of a locomotive. Train. Clara dropped her hands to her lap. She looked down at her dusty boots. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. It was a secret she had carried for 3 years, a heavy, jagged rock in her chest. She had a carpet bag, Clara whispered. It was dark. Pa was asleep. I heard the floorboards creak. Abby sat perfectly still. I peeked out my door, Clara went on. A tear slipped down her cheek, leaving a clean track in the barn dust. She was putting her brush in the bag. She had her heavy coat on. She didn't look in my room. She just walked down the stairs, and she walked out the door. Clara looked up. Her face was twisted in pain. An 8-year-old girl carrying the grief of a grown woman. The next day, Pa told me she was sick. He told me she had the typhus. He took me to the Higgins spread for a week. When he came to get me, he said she died. He said they buried her in the churchyard. Clara wiped her nose with the back of her sleeve. But she didn't die, Abby. She just didn't want us. Abby felt her own heart crack. She looked at this fierce, stubborn little girl. A girl who had spent 3 years pretending her mother was a tragic memory, just to protect her father's pride. Clara knew her father was lying, and she loved him enough to let him get away with it. Abby raised her hands. She pressed her hand flat against her chest, over her heart. I am sorry. Clara let out a choked sob. She scrambled off the hay bale. She didn't hesitate. She ran across the loft and threw her arms around Abby's neck. Abby caught her. She wrapped her arms around the trembling girl. She buried her face in Clara's hair. She held on tight. She didn't shush her. She didn't tell her not to cry. She just let the dam break. Down below, the barn doors creaked open. Heavy boots stepped onto the dirt floor. Clara, Abby? It was Nate. His voice echoed up to the loft. Clara froze. She let go of Abby and scrubbed at her face frantically. She didn't want him to see. She didn't want to break the rules. Nate climbed the wooden ladder. His head popped up over the edge of the loft. He had a coil of rope over his shoulder. He saw them. He saw the tear streaks on Clara's face. He saw the fierce, protective way Abby was sitting beside her. Nate's brow furrowed. The casual ease dropped from his posture. The father kicked in, the protector. What happened? Nate asked. His voice was sharp. He stepped off the ladder. Clara, did you get hurt? Clara shook her head. She looked at the floor. Then why are you crying? He looked at Abby, a flash of suspicion. What did you show her? What happened up here? Abby stood up. She didn't shrink back. She looked Nate dead in the eye. Then she raised her hand. She pointed a single finger directly at his chest. Nate stopped. What? Abby kept pointing at him. Her face was hard, unrelenting. You happened. Nate's jaw tightened. I don't have time for guessing games, Abby. If she's hurt, tell me. Abby shook her head. She pointed to Clara. Then she made the sign they had just used. Thumb to the chin, fingers spread. Mother. Nate's face drained of color. The rope slipped off his shoulder. It hit the hay with a dull thud. He looked at Clara. The little girl wouldn't meet his eyes. She was staring at her boots, her shoulders hunched. Clara, Nate breathed. The word barely made it past his lips. He knew. The lie was over. The house was suffocatingly quiet. Evening had fallen. The lamps were lit in the sitting room. The fire cracked in the hearth, spitting sparks against the iron screen. Nate stood by the mantel. He held a glass of whiskey, but he hadn't taken a sip. He was staring at the flames. Clara sat on the leather sofa. She looked small, fragile. Abby sat in the armchair across from them. Her notebook was open on her lap. Her pencil was in her hand. It was 3 years ago, Nate finally said. He didn't look at them. He spoke to the fire. It was a hard winter. We lost half the herd. The cabin was freezing. She couldn't take it anymore. The isolation, the dirt, the quiet. He took a slow breath. I woke up and she was gone. I rode into town. The station master told me she bought a ticket on the eastbound train. She left her wedding ring on the ticket counter. Nate turned around. He looked at Clara. His eyes were wide with a desperate kind of pleading. You were 5 years old, Clara. Just 5. How was I supposed to tell a 5-year-old girl that her mother walked out into the snow and chose a train over her? Clara looked at her hands. I knew, Pa. I saw her leave. Nate flinched, like he had been struck. You knew? His voice broke. All this time, you knew? I didn't want you to be sad, Clara whispered. You said she got sick, so I pretended she got sick. Nate closed his eyes. The whiskey glass trembled in his hand. He set it down on the mantel before he dropped it. I was protecting you, Nate said. He sounded defensive now, grasping for justification. A child shouldn't know that kind of rejection. It's too heavy. I gave you a clean death to mourn. I made her a victim of a fever instead of a woman who just didn't care. He looked at Abby, seeking an ally, seeking a pardon. You understand, right? Nate asked her. You know what the world does to people. I was shielding my daughter. Abby didn't nod. She didn't offer a pardon. She put her pencil to the paper. She began to write. She wrote fast. The pencil scratched loudly in the quiet room. It sounded like a match striking over and over. Nate watched her. His chest tightened. He knew that sound. He knew she wasn't writing a comfort. She was writing the truth, and the truth always had teeth. Abby finished the page. She ripped it out of the notebook. She stood up. She walked over to the mantel. She held the paper out to Nate. Nate looked at it. He didn't want to take it. He wanted the lie back. He wanted the neat, tragic story of typhus back. But Abby's hand didn't lower. Nate took the paper. Abby took a step back. She tapped her ear. Then she pointed to his mouth. Read it aloud. Nate swallowed. The paper felt heavy in his hands. It was just a scrap of paper, but it felt like a judgment. He looked down at Abby's neat black handwriting. He cleared his throat. He looked at Clara, sitting small and tense on the sofa. Then he looked back at the page. He read the words. His voice was slow, heavy with the weight of his own failure. We often use protection as an excuse to rob children of their right to the truth, Nate read aloud. The words hung in the air, clear, unforgiving. Nate's jaw tightened. He forced himself to continue. He had to say it. He had to hear it. But, sir, children are far more capable of understanding grief than adults give them credit for, provided we treat them with equal respect. Nate stopped. He looked over the edge of the paper at his daughter. Clara was looking at him now, not at her boots, not at her hands. She was looking right into his eyes. And she didn't look like a fragile 5-year-old. She looked like a survivor. Nate looked back at the paper, his vision blurred. He read the final lines. He made sure his voice carried clearly across the room. Comforting lies only breed chronic trauma. Give Clara back her right to mourn with transparency. Nate lowered the paper. The silence in the room was absolute. Only the pop and hiss of the firewood broke the quiet. Nate let the paper slip from his fingers. It fluttered to the floor, landing near the hearth. He looked at the woman standing in front of him. A woman who couldn't speak, but who had just delivered the most articulate, devastating lecture on parenting he had ever heard. She didn't let him hide behind his pride. She didn't let him dress his cowardice up as nobility. Nate turned to Clara. He walked over to the sofa. He didn't sit beside her. He sank down onto his knees on the braided rug right in front of her. He put himself lower than his daughter. He reached out and took Clara's small hands in his big rough ones. I was wrong, Nate said. His voice was thick. I was a coward. I didn't want to see the look on your face when I told you she chose to leave. I was protecting myself, Clara, not you. Clara's lower lip trembled. I am so sorry, Nate whispered. I am so sorry I made you carry that alone. Didn't pull away. She slid off the sofa. She fell to her knees on the rug right in front of him. She wrapped her arms around his thick neck and buried her face in his shoulder. Nate crushed her to his chest. He closed his eyes, burying his face in her hair. She left us, Nate whispered into the quiet room. She left us, and it hurts, and it's okay to be angry about it. It's okay to hate it. Clara nodded against his shoulder. She cried. But this time, they weren't the quiet, secret tears in a dusty hayloft. They were loud, they were shared, they were clean. Abby watched them from the hearth. She bent down. She picked up the piece of paper she had written. She didn't crumple it up. She didn't throw it in the fire. She carefully folded it in half. She walked over to the armchair and set it on the small side table. A reminder. She looked at the father and daughter holding each other on the floor. The lie was dead. The infection was cleared out. The wound was raw and painful, but for the first time in 3 years had a chance to heal. Abby backed out of the sitting room. She stepped quietly into the hallway, leaving them to their grief. She walked toward the kitchen to put the kettle on. She didn't have a voice. But tonight, she was the one who had finally spoken the truth in this house. The dust cloud appeared long before the buggy did. Nate saw it from the corral. He was working a green horse, young buckskin that didn't like the saddle. But Nate stopped. He wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of his leather glove. He watched the road. Nobody came out this far unless they were lost, or unless they wanted something. The buggy rolled into the yard. Black wheels, black horses, a man in black sitting on the bench. It looked like a funeral coming to call. Nate unlatched the corral gate. He stepped out. Reverend Josiah Blackwood pulled the reins. The horses stopped. The Reverend didn't look like a hard man. He looked soft, clean hands, polished boots, a white collar, cutting into a thick pink neck. He smiled, but his eyes were flat, dead like 2 pieces of river glass. Beside him sat Sheriff Sam Vance. Sam looked miserable. He kept his eyes on the dashboard of the buggy. He held his hat in his hands. "Brother Thorne," Blackwood called out. His voice was smooth, like oil running over warm iron. "A beautiful morning the Lord has given us." Nate didn't smile. He didn't offer a hand. "Reverend," Nate said. His voice was a flat line. "Sheriff, what brings the law and the church to my front yard?" Blackwood sighed, a heavy, theatrical sigh. He climbed down from the buggy. He smoothed his black wool coat. "A matter of unfortunate housekeeping, Nathaniel. A burden I take no joy in." Blackwood reached inside his breast pocket. He pulled out a folded piece of heavy parchment. It was tied with a red ribbon. He held it like it was holy scripture. "The Lord provides," Blackwood said gently, "but the law requires paperwork. The Homestead Act of 1862 was a blessing to this territory, but it has rules. Strict rules regarding continuous habitation and proper filing." Nate crossed his arms. The leather of his gloves creaked. "Get to the point, Josiah." Blackwood's smile tightened. "Just a fraction." "The northern 800 acres of your spread," Blackwood said. "The land bordering the Sweetwater Creek. Our records in town show the original deed from 1872 was misfiled. An error in the boundaries. According to the territorial office, that parcel was legally abandoned 3 years ago." Nate went completely still. "The northern 800. That was the water. In a dry summer, that creek was the only thing keeping his herd from turning into bleached bones. Without that land, the rest of the ranch was worthless." "I bought that land from the bank," Nate said. His voice was dangerously quiet. "I paid cash. I've run wire across it. I've grazed cattle on it. It's mine." "You bought a flawed deed," Blackwood corrected gently. He tapped the parchment. "The church, seeing a piece of God's earth sitting legally unclaimed, filed the proper petition in Helena last month. The territory granted it. The church owns the northern parcel now, Nathaniel." Nate looked at Sheriff Vance. "Sam," Nate said, "you're standing here backing a thief in a collar?" Vance flinched. He looked up, his face flushed. "Nate, I just look at the paper. The paper has the territorial seal." It's signed by the governor's office. I don't write the laws. I just have to enforce them. It's a mistake, Nate growled. He took a step forward. Or it's a lie. Careful, Brother Thorne, Blackwood murmured. Anger is the devil's playground. You have 30 days to move your wire and your cattle off church property. If you don't, the sheriff will have to confiscate the herd as penalty. The porch boards creaked. Abby walked down the steps. She wore a clean blue cotton dress. Her hair was pinned back. She didn't carry her rifle, but the way she walked, measured, silent, unblinking, made Blackwood take half a step back. She walked straight up to the Reverend. She didn't look at his face. She looked at the paper in his hand. She held out her hand. Palm up. Give it to me, Blackwood scoffed. This is legal business, Mrs. Thorne. Complex matters. I don't think a woman in your unfortunate condition needs to trouble herself. Abby didn't lower her hand. She just turned her head and looked at Nate. Nate stepped up. He crowded Blackwood. He was 4 inches taller and built from muscle and hard work. Give my wife the paper, Josiah. Blackwood hesitated. He looked at Sam Vance. Sam just looked away. Grudgingly, Blackwood handed the parch to Abby. Took it. She didn't just read it. She felt it. Before Kansas. Before the blood and the silence. Abby's father had been a county clerk in Ellsworth. For 5 years, she sat at the desk beside him. She sorted deeds. She stamped land grants. She knew the smell of government ink. She knew the texture of state-issued vellum. She opened the document. Her eyes scanned the dense legal print. It looked perfect. The margins were right. The language was right. Then she looked at the bottom of the page. The seal. The Great Seal of the Montana Territory. It was stamped in red ink. A plow, a pick, and a shovel. The mountains in the background. The words Oro y Plata, gold and silver. Abby rubbed her thumb over the ink. It was smooth. A territorial seal wasn't just a rubber stamp. It was an embossing. It was pressed by a heavy iron machine in Helena that crushed the paper fibers. You could feel the mountains with your fingernail. This was flat, and the date, 1872. Abby pulled her pencil from her pocket. She circled the date. She circled the seal. She flipped her notebook open. She wrote quickly, furious, jagged strokes. She shoved the notebook into Nate's hands. Nate looked down. It is a forgery. The seal is flat. Helena uses an iron embosser, and the ink on a 6-year-old document fades to brown. This ink is black. It was stamped this week. Nate read it twice. His blood went cold. Then it boiled. He looked at Blackwood. The Reverend's smug smile faltered. Just a flicker, but Nate saw it. He knew. Nate didn't shout. He didn't punch the man. He just folded the parchment and put it in his own pocket. We're going to town, Nate said. Right now. The sheriff's office smelled like stale coffee and old iron. Wanted posters plastered the wood-paneled walls. The iron bars of the holding cell stood empty in the back. Sheriff Sam Vance sat behind his heavy oak desk. He was sweating. He wiped his forehead with a dirty handkerchief. Nate stood in the center of the room. Abby stood right beside him. Her presence was quiet, but it was heavy, like a loaded gun sitting on a table. Reverend Blackwood stood by the window. He looked bored, but his hands were clasped too tight behind his back. Nate, you can't just take the deed, Vance pleaded. You have to give it back to the Reverend. It's church property. Nate pulled the document from his pocket. He didn't give it to Blackwood. He slammed it down on Vance's desk. The wood shuddered. Look at it, Sam, Nate commanded. I've looked at it, Vance said, rubbing his eyes. It's a legal deed. It's a fake, Nate said. His voice was a hammer. Blackwood let out a soft, patronizing laugh. Sheriff, really? Are we going to entertain the delusions of a man losing his land? Or worse, the silent scribblings of his wife? The poor woman can't even speak, and we are trusting her as a legal expert? Abby didn't flinch. She just stared at Blackwood. Her eyes were dark and steady. She had seen real monsters. Blackwood was just a thief in a suit. Nate leaned over the desk. He planted his fists on the wood. He got right in the sheriff's face. My wife's father was a county clerk, Nate said. She handled more deeds before she was 20 than you've seen in your whole life. The seal is flat. It's rubber. Helena doesn't use rubber, and the ink is fresh. You rub it, it smudges. Nate dragged his leather-gloved thumb across the red seal. He held his thumb up. The tip of the leather was stained pink. Vance stared at the pink smudge. He swallowed hard. The Adam's apple in his throat bobbed. Even if it is a mistake, Vance stammered. He was terrified. He was a small-town lawman. Blackwood controlled the town council. Blackwood controlled the bank. It could just be a clerical error, a misprint in Helena. Nate, he's a man of God. You can't accuse the Reverend of forgery. I can't arrest him on a smudge. Vance looked down at his desk. He wouldn't meet Nate's eyes. The law is the law, Vance mumbled. He has the paper, and the paper has power. I have to uphold it. Nate stood up straight. He looked at Sam Vance, a man he had known for 5 years, a man who was letting fear override his duty. Nate didn't yell. The room was perfectly quiet, but his voice filled every corner of it. It was heavy. It was absolute, and it cut right to the bone of the matter. Justice may be blind, Sheriff, but she isn't stupid. Vance flinched. Nate kept his eyes locked on the sheriff. He spoke slowly, making sure every single word landed like a brick. When a man in a clerical collar uses the Lord's name to legitimize stealing a farmer's blood, sweat, and tears, that isn't divine will. Nate pointed a finger at Blackwood. He didn't look at him. He kept staring at Vance. That is systemic oppression. The law must protect the vulnerable, not serve as a sword for the wealthy to consolidate power. The words hung in the stale air. They weren't just words about a piece of land. They were the absolute truth of the frontier, the truth of a world where men with money and influence built empires by crushing the people who actually worked the dirt. Vance sat frozen in his chair. The handkerchief was balled tight in his fist. He looked at the forged deed. He looked at the pink ink on Nate's glove. Then he looked at Abby. She was standing perfectly straight. She tapped her own chest. Then she pointed to the deed. Then she pointed to the door. We are not leaving this land, and we are not backing down. Blackwood cleared his throat. The smugness was gone. The fake smile was gone. His face was hard and ugly. You are making a grave mistake, Nathaniel, Blackwood said coldly. The Lord punishes the wicked, and the church does not tolerate slander. You have 30 days. Then the sheriff rides out with a posse. Smudge or no smudge. Blackwood turned. He walked out of the office. The door slammed shut behind him. Nate didn't watch him go. He kept looking at Vance. You have a badge, Sam, Nate said quietly. Figure out what it means. Because if you ride out to my spread in 30 days to take my water, I won't be greeting you with a cup of coffee. Nate picked up the deed. He folded it, put it back in his pocket. He turned to Abby. He offered her his arm. She took it. They walked out of the sheriff's office together. They stepped out into the bright Montana sun. The street was dusty. The people watched them from the boardwalks, whispering, staring. Abby didn't lower her head. She squeezed Nate's arm. Just a slight pressure. Nate looked down at her. He saw the fire in her eyes. The same fire he saw the day she stepped off the train with a Winchester on her shoulder. They were going to fight. Nate patted her hand. He helped her into the wagon. They didn't speak on the ride home. They didn't need to. The battle lines were drawn. The Reverend had picked a fight with a broken doctor and a mute bride. He thought they were weak. He thought they were easy prey. He was dead wrong. The wind blew hot and dry through Millhaven. Dust devils danced down the center of the street. Abby stepped out of the general store. She carried a sack of flour against her hip. The weight was heavy, grounding. It felt like normal life. A life she was still trying to get used to. She stopped on the boardwalk. Across the street, the batwing doors of the saloon swung open. A man stepped out. He didn't look like a local ranch hand. He wore a long canvas duster, a flat-brimmed hat. He looked like a man who had ridden a very long way on a very bad road. He struck a match on a porch post. He lit a cigarette. Then he looked up. He looked right at Abby. Abby froze. The sack of flour felt like lead. Her breath caught in her throat. It wasn't Silas Miller. Silas was dead. She had seen the light leave his eyes 7 years ago. She had pulled the trigger. But the man standing across the street had Silas's jaw. Silas's heavy, sloping shoulders. Silas's dark, deep-set eyes. The man didn't reach for a gun. He didn't shout. He just took his hat off. He nodded to her, once. A slow, deliberate dip of his head. Then he turned and walked down the boardwalk toward the hotel. Abby didn't run, but her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She walked back to the wagon. She set the flour down. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely untie the reins. That evening, a rider from town came out to the Thorn Ranch. He brought a single envelope. It was addressed to A. Prescott. Nate handed it to her in the kitchen. He didn't ask questions. He just stood near the stove, watching her face as she opened it. Abby broke the wax seal. The paper was cheap. The handwriting was blocky and uneven. Miss Prescott, I am Roy Miller. Silas was my older brother. I tracked the gun from the bounty office in Kansas. I didn't come to Montana to kill you. Silas was a bad man. He got what he earned. But that Winchester belonged to my father. It's the only thing left of my family. I want it back. I am sitting at the corner table in the saloon. I will wait 3 days. Bring it, and you'll never see my face again. Abby read it. She read it again. She set the letter on the table. She stared at the wood grain. 7 years. She had carried a rifle across 3 states. She had slept with it across her chest. It was her voice. It was her shield. It was the heavy iron proof that she hadn't just laid down and died in the dirt. Giving it back to a Miller felt like surrendering. It felt like a betrayal to her parents' memory. Nate picked up the letter. He read it in silence. He looked at Abby. He didn't tell her what to do. He didn't offer to go shoot the man. He just folded the paper. Do you want me to ride into town? Nate asked quietly. I can tell him to leave. I can tell him the gun stays here. Abby shook her head. She walked into the sitting room. She walked to the mantel. The Winchester rested there, clean, oiled, loaded. She reached out. She touched the cool steel of the barrel. If she kept it, she kept the ghost. Every time she looked at the wood, she would remember the cellar. She would remember the blood. Roy Miller wasn't asking for a weapon. He was asking for an heirloom, and maybe he was asking for an end to the story. She pulled the rifle off the mantel. She checked the chamber. She popped the brass cartridges out, one by one. They hit the wooden floor with a dull thud. She handed the empty gun to Nate. She tapped her chest. Then she pointed toward the door. We go together. The saloon was quiet for a Tuesday afternoon. The smell of stale beer and cheap cigars hung thick in the air. A few ranch hands sat at the bar. The piano in the corner was silent. Roy Miller sat at a table in the far back. The shadows hid most of his face. He had a glass of whiskey in front of him. He wasn't drinking it. The batwing doors creaked. Nate walked in first. His presence changed the air in the room. He was big. He was quiet. He moved with the dangerous grace of a veteran who knew exactly where the exits were. Abby walked in right behind him. She held the Winchester in her hands. Roy stood up. He took his hat off. He looked older up close. Tired. The kind of tired that sleep couldn't fix. He kept his hands flat on the table. Empty, showing he meant no harm. Nate pulled out a chair for Abby. She sat down across from Roy. Nate stood right behind her right shoulder, a solid wall of muscle and bone. Roy looked at the rifle in her hands. He swallowed hard. "I appreciate you coming, ma'am," Roy said. His voice was gravelly. "I didn't want to frighten you." Abby didn't smile. She didn't offer forgiveness with her eyes. She just placed the Winchester on the scarred wood of the table. She pushed it across. The heavy barrel scraped against the table. The sound was loud in the quiet saloon. It stopped an inch from Roy's hands. Roy looked down at it. He saw where Nate had begun sanding the name Silas off the stock. A sharp breath hitched in Roy's chest. He reached out and touched the wood. His hand trembled. "He was a monster," Roy whispered. He didn't look up. "He beat my mother. He stole from our neighbors. When he rode off to join those bushwhackers, I prayed he wouldn't come back. I prayed someone would stop him." Roy looked up at Abby. His eyes were red. "I'm sorry," Roy said. "For what he did to your folks. I am truly sorry." Abby looked at him. She saw a man broken by the sins of his own blood, a man carrying a heavy, inherited shame. She reached into her pocket. She pulled out her leather notebook. She pulled out her pencil. She didn't hesitate. She didn't have to think about what to write. The words had been building inside her for 7 years, waiting for the right person to take them. She wrote a single paragraph. She pressed hard. The lead was dark and bold. She ripped the page out. She handed it over her shoulder to Nate. Nate took the paper. He looked at her. She nodded. "Read it." Nate cleared his throat. The saloon was dead silent. Every man at the bar was listening. Nate didn't care. He looked right at Roy Miller. He pitched his voice loud enough for every soul in the room to hear. "Hatred is a prison that locks up both the victim and the perpetrator's kin," Nate read. His voice was steady, like a preacher reading a final psalm. Roy froze. He stared at Nate, listening to the words coming from the silent woman across the table. Nate continued, "I am returning this, not because your family deserves forgiveness, but because I deserve to be free. Forgiveness doesn't erase the crime, but it severs the chain, dragging us both down into the same mud." Nate set the paper down on top of the rifle. Roy Miller stared at the handwritten words. A tear broke loose and tracked through the dust on his cheek. He didn't wipe it away. "Thank you," Roy whispered. His voice broke. "Thank you, ma'am." He picked up the rifle. He folded the piece of paper and put it carefully into his breast pocket. He stood up. He put his hat back on. He turned and walked out the back door of the saloon. He didn't look back. Abby sat at the table. Her hands were empty. The heavy weight on her shoulder was gone. The cold steel she had clung to for survival was gone. For a fleeting second, she felt naked, vulnerable. Then, Nate's large, warm hand rested on her shoulder. The grip was firm, grounding, safe. Abby reached up. She covered his hand with her own. She squeezed his fingers. She didn't need the gun anymore. The war was over. She was finally ready to live in the peace. 3 days passed since Roy Miller rode out of town. But peace didn't settle on the Thorn Ranch. Reverend Blackwood's shadow still hung over the northern 800 acres. The 30-day deadline was ticking down like a pocket watch in a quiet room. Nate didn't wait for the sheriff to act. He rode to the telegraph office. He wired Denver, the Pinkerton National Detective Agency. He spent $100 in gold eagle coins, money he had saved to buy winter feed. But feed didn't matter if you didn't have land to put it on. He needed a man who knew how to hunt paper trails, a man who wasn't afraid of a church collar. Now they waited. It was late afternoon. The sky was the color of a bruised plum. Rain was coming over the mountains. Nate was on the porch, fixing a broken bridle. Clara was sitting on the steps, practicing her letters on a slate board. Abby was in the kitchen, the smell of baking bread drifting out the screen door. A sound cut through the wind. Hoofbeats. Steady. Deliberate. Nate stopped working. He set the leather down. He stood up. A lone rider came up the long dirt drive. He rode a tall, dark bay horse. He wore a gray suit, dusty from the trail, but sharply tailored. A bowler hat sat low over his eyes. A silver pocket watch chain glinted against his dark vest. He didn't look like a cowboy. He didn't look like a lawman. He looked like trouble dressed up for church. The rider pulled his horse up near the porch. He didn't dismount right away. He sat in the saddle. He looked at the house. He looked at the barn. He looked at the northern pasture. Taking it all in, assessing the value of the dirt and the men standing on it. Finally, he looked at Nate. "Nathaniel Thorne," the rider asked. His voice was deep, a little raspy, like a man who had swallowed too much tracheal dust in his life. Nate nodded slowly. He stepped down off the porch. He kept his right hand near his hip. "I'm Thorne. You the man from Denver?" The rider nodded. He swung his leg over the saddle and dropped to the dirt. He tied the reins to the hitching post. "Pinkerton Agency," the man said. "Got your wire. Looked into Reverend Josiah Blackwood before I left Colorado. He got a history. Left a trail of forged deeds in Wyoming 3 years ago. We can pin him." I brought the paperwork to prove his territorial seal is a fake. Nate let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. The relief was sudden and sharp. "I appreciate it, mister." Nate trailed off, waiting for a name. The detective turned around. He reached up. He pulled the bowler hat off his head. The fading sunlight hit his face. Nate stopped breathing. The world went perfectly silent. The wind stopped howling. The horses stopped shifting. Time just snapped in half. The man standing in the dirt had a scar running through his left eyebrow. His hair was a little thinner. There were heavy lines around his mouth. He looked older, harder, but the eyes were the same. The jaw was the same. The face was the face Nate saw every morning in the shaving mirror. "My name is Matt," the detective said quietly. Nate took a step backward. His heel hit the wooden stairs. He stumbled. He grabbed the porch railing to keep from falling. His knuckles went white. "No," Nate whispered. The words sounded like a dying gasp. "No, you died. Gettysburg. I was there. I had my hands inside you." Matt S.'s face softened. The hard, professional detective melted away. He just looked like a tired younger brother. "I didn't die, Nate," Matt said softly. "I almost did. I flatlined on your table. They pulled you away. They threw me in a tent with the corpses. But the bleeding stopped. A burial detail found me breathing the next morning. Transferred me to a hospital in Philadelphia." Nate was shaking. His entire body vibrated. "Why didn't you find me?" Nate's voice cracked. Tears welled up, spilling over his weathered cheeks. 15 years, Matt. 15 years I thought I killed you." Matt took a step forward. "I woke up with no memory, Nate. The fever cooked my brain. I didn't know my name. I didn't know I had a brother. It took 5 years just to remember how to read." Matt looked down at his dusty boots. "By the time the pieces came back, by the time I remembered you, I tracked you here. But I asked around town first. They said you had a wife who died, a little girl. You were grieving. You were quiet. I thought I thought coming back from the dead would just break you all over again. So I stayed away until you wired the agency. Nate didn't care about the logic. He didn't care about the agency. He lunged forward. He cleared the space between them in two massive strides. He threw his arms around his brother. He crushed Matt against his chest. A ragged, tearing sob ripped out of Nate's throat. The sound of 15-year wound finally closing. Matt hugged him back, just as hard. The two grown men stood in the dirt, burying their faces in each other's shoulders, crying like lost boys in the dark. Claire watched from the steps. Her eyes were wide. The screen door banged open. Abby stepped out onto the porch. She had heard the shout. She had a heavy iron skillet in her hand, ready to swing. She stopped at the edge of the stairs. She lowered the iron pan. She stared at the two men pulling apart. She looked at Nate's tear-streaked face, and then she looked at the detective. Matt wiped his eyes with his sleeve. He looked up at the porch. He saw Abby. Matt froze. His eyes went wide. The color drained from his face. He took a slow step toward the stairs. He stared at Abby like he was seeing a ghost. "Ellsworth," Matt breathed. Abby's hands started to shake. The skillet dropped from her grip. It hit the wooden porch with a deafening clang. It was him 7 years ago, the night Silas Miller died. A wandering Union soldier with no name and hollow eyes had heard the gunshot. He had run into the farmhouse. He had found a 19-year-old girl covered in blood, shivering in the dark. He hadn't turned her in. He hadn't asked questions. He had taken her by the hand, hidden her in the root cellar, and then he had ridden out to the main road, firing his pistol into the air to draw the rest of the bushwhackers away from the house. He saved her life, and then he vanished into the night. Abby raised her hands to her mouth. Tears spilled down her face. She nodded. A frantic, desperate nod. "Yes, yes, it's me." Nate looked back and forth between his wife and his brother. He wiped his face, confusion cutting through the shock. "You know each other?" Nate asked. His voice was thick. Matt let out a breathless, disbelieving laugh. He looked at Nate. The awe in his face was absolute. Matt walked up the steps. He didn't look at Abby as a stranger. He looked at her like a miracle. He turned back to Nate, his voice ringing out, clear over the sound of the approaching rain. "Kindness is never meaningless, Nate," Matt said. He spoke the words with a fierce, unwavering conviction. He wanted to carve them into his brother's mind. "You saved hundreds of men, but carried the guilt of failing to save me," Matt continued, pointing a finger at his own chest, then gesturing toward Abby. "I lost my memory and wandered, but the instincts you instilled in me allowed me to save your future wife that day. We plant seeds of compassion, and the universe, in its ultimate fairness, allows them to bloom to protect our own family." Nate stood at the bottom of the stairs. He looked at his brother. He looked at his wife. The heavy, suffocating guilt that had defined his life for a decade and a half evaporated into the Montana wind. He wasn't cursed. He wasn't broken. He walked up the stairs. He put one arm around his brother's shoulder. He put his other arm around Abby's waist. He pulled them both in close. The first drops of rain began to fall, hitting the dusty porch roof like a drumbeat, a steady, rhythmic sound of washing the past away. Reverend Blackwood had wanted to start a war over dirt and paper. He had no idea what he was walking into. He wasn't facing a broken doctor and a silent bride anymore. He was facing a family forged in fire, and they weren't going to lose. The church in Millhaven was built for salvation. Tonight, it felt like a slaughterhouse. It was a Tuesday evening. The air inside the white clapboard building was hot, stifling. Too many bodies crammed into the wooden pews. The smell of sweat, damp wool, and cheap tobacco hung thick near the rafters. Reverend Josiah Blackwood stood at the pulpit. He didn't look like a shepherd leading his flock. He looked like a wolf backed into a corner. His face was flushed. His collar looked too tight. He knew the Pinkertons were sniffing around his paper trail. He knew his time was running out. So he went on the offensive. He didn't attack Nate. He attacked the weakest link. He attacked the woman who couldn't talk back. The devil doesn't always come with horns. Blackwood bellowed. His voice echoed off the wooden walls. He pointed a trembling finger toward the back doors. Sometimes he comes in silence. He comes carrying a rifle and hiding a pat soaked in blood. The townsfolk muttered. Heads turned. Whispers hissed through the pews like dry leaves. Nathaniel Thorne has brought a viper into our community, Blackwood continued, slamming his fist down on the heavy oak pulpit. I have it on good authority. That woman is a psychopathic fugitive, a murderer from Kansas. She's here to steal land, manipulate a grieving widower, and corrupt an innocent child. The crowd was getting restless. Fear makes people stupid, and Blackwood was an expert at farming fear. The heavy double doors at the back of the church swung open. They didn't just open. They slammed hard against the interior walls. The noise cracked through the church like a cannon shot. The muttering stopped. Every head in the room snapped backward. Nate Thorne stood in the doorway. He didn't wear a suit. He wore his work clothes. Dust on his boots, canvas jacket. He looked massive filling up the frame. To his right stood Matt, the Pinkerton detective. Sharp suit, bowler hat, eyes scanning the room, counting the exits and the threats. And standing right between them, dead center, was Abby. She wore her dark blue dress. She held her chin high. Her face was a mask of absolute calm. She walked down the center aisle. Nate and Matt flanked her. Two brothers, two soldiers. Walking into hostile territory, the crowd parted. People pulled their knees back, like they were afraid her dress might touch them. Abby didn't look at the townsfolk. She kept her eyes locked dead on Josiah Blackwood. They stopped at the front pew. Nate stepped forward. You've got a lot of nerve, Josiah, Nate said. His voice wasn't a yell. It was a low, heavy rumble. Calling a town meeting to talk about my wife. Blackwood sneered. He held his ground behind the pulpit. The flock needs to be warned, Nathaniel. You are blinded by the flesh. That woman is a wanted killer, and you are harboring her. Matt stepped up. He reached inside his tailored coat. He didn't pull a gun. He pulled a thick stack of telegrams and legal papers. Matthew Thorne, Matt announced clearly. Pinkerton National Detective Agency, and you, Reverend, are a liar. The crowd gasped. Matt held up the papers. I wired the sheriff in Ellsworth, Kansas. Abigail Prescott is not a fugitive. She is the sole survivor of a massacre. The man she shot was a wanted bushwhacker named Silas Miller. It was ruled self-defense by a judge 7 years ago. The case is closed. Matt dropped the Kansas papers on the altar. He pulled out the next stack. Now, Matt said, his voice sharpening, let's talk about Wyoming. Let's talk about a man in a collar who forged 3 land deeds in Cheyenne before fleeing the territory. I have the sworn affidavits right here. Your territorial seal is a rubber stamp you bought in Denver, Blackwood. The church went dead silent. You could hear the wick of an oil lamp burning. Blackwood gripped the edges of the pulpit. His knuckles were bone white. The veins in his neck bulged. Lies, Blackwood spat. He pointed at Abby. Look at her standing there. She doesn't speak because she is mad. She is touched in the head. The silence is proof of her guilt. Are you going to believe a godless detective over your own reverend? Are you going to let a madwoman take this town's land? A few men in the backs stood up, nervous, agitated. The mob mentality was swaying. It was teetering on a knife's edge. Before Nate could throw a punch, an old man stood up from the front row. Doc Thaddeus Boone. Doc Boone was 70 years old. He had delivered half the people in this room. He had closed the eyes of their dying parents. He held an iron cane in his right hand. He didn't look at Blackwood. He turned his back to the pulpit. He faced the congregation. He planted his cane hard on the wooden floor. "Sit down," Doc Boone ordered the men in the back. It wasn't a request. It was the voice of a man who had set their broken legs and cured their fevers. They sat down. Doc Boone looked over the crowd. He looked at the fear. He looked at the ignorance. He shook his white head in disgust. "You people," Doc Boone said, his voice gravelly but carrying perfectly through the quiet room. "You come in here every Sunday. You talk about grace. You talk about charity." He raised his cane and pointed it straight at the center of the crowd. "This woman's silence is viewed by you as a sign of madness and malice," Doc Boone said. The anger in his voice was raw, piercing. "That is the toxic mindset of those who relish trampling on the weak. You blame the wounded for bleeding." He turned slightly, gesturing toward Abby, though he didn't point his cane at her. He offered her respect. "Medicine proves her soul is fractured because it endured the absolute depths of human cruelty," Doc Boone stated firmly, making sure every word was explicitly understood. "Her silence is a scar earned by surviving a night none of you could have lived through. And what do? You weaponize her trauma. You use her pain as proof of her guilt." Doc Boone slammed his cane against the floor again. The sharp crack made people jump. "For our community to rally behind a hypocrite, to crush a survivor that is the true incurable plague of this society," Doc Boone shouted. "You want to cast a demon out of this town? Look at the man behind the pulpit stealing your neighbor's land. Stop throwing stones at a woman who just wants to be left in peace." The church was dead, quiet. The shame settled over the pews. Thick, heavy. The townsfolk looked at their laps. They looked at their boots. Nobody looked at Blackwood. The spell was broken. The mob was gone. Sheriff Sam Vance stood up from a pew near the side aisle. He looked at Matt Thorne. He looked at the Pinkerton files resting on the altar. Then he looked at Blackwood. Vance unhooked the leather strap over his revolver. "Josiah Blackwood," Vance said. His voice shook a little, but he stepped forward anyway. "I'm holding you for the circuit, Judge. Forgery. Fraud. Come down from there." Blackwood stood at the pulpit. The flock had turned. The wolf was trapped. He didn't fight. He just deflated. The fake righteous posture collapsed. He walked down the altar steps, his eyes on the floor. Abby watched him pass. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She just reached out and took Nate S.'s hand. His fingers were rough, calloused, warm. He squeezed her hand tight. They walked out of the church together, back into the cool night air. The stars were out. The storm was over. The county courthouse in Helena smelled of lemon oil and old paper. It was a vast room. High ceilings, tall windows, rows of heavy oak benches. It had been 3 weeks since the night at the church. Blackwood's trial was swift. The Pinkerton evidence was solid. But the defense attorney, a slick, expensive lawyer from back east, was fighting dirty. He was trying to get the forgery charges thrown out on a technicality. Nate Thorne had coerced the investigation. They needed the linchpin. They needed the person who first spotted the fake seal. They needed Abby on the stand. Abby sat at the prosecution table. Her notebook was open. Her pencil was sharp, but her hands were cold, ice cold. "Mrs. Thorne," the prosecutor whispered, leaning over. I can submit your written testimony. But the defense will object. They will say a silent witness cannot be properly cross-examined. They will tear the paper apart. A jury needs to hear a voice. They need to hear conviction. Abby looked down at the blank page. For 7 years, the lock in her throat had kept her safe. It kept the world at a distance. It kept the memories of her screaming mother locked away in the dark. If she opened that door, what else would come out? Nate sat in the gallery, right behind the wooden railing. He was leaning forward. His eyes never left her. He didn't look expectant. He didn't look demanding. He just looked like an anchor, steady, immovable. The prosecution calls Abigail Thorne to the stand, the judge announced. His voice echoed off the high ceiling. Abby stood up. Her legs felt heavy, like wading through river mud. She walked to the witness box. She placed her left hand on the Bibler. The bailiff recited the oath. She nodded her head. She sat down. The defense attorney stood up immediately. He was a tall man in a gray suit. He smiled like a shark smelling blood in the water. Your Honor, the defense attorney smoothly interrupted. How are we to proceed? Am I to cross-examine a piece of paper? My client is facing prison. The Constitution guarantees his right to confront his accuser. If this woman cannot speak, she cannot testify. The judge frowned. He looked at Abby. Mrs. Thorne, the court understands your condition. But counsel makes a valid legal point. Can you answer his questions verbally? Abby gripped the wooden rail of the witness box. Her knuckles turned white. She looked at Blackwood, sitting at the defense table. The smugness was creeping back into his face. He thought he had won. He thought he could silence her, just like the monsters in Kansas had. She looked at Clara, sitting in the back row next to Matt. The little girl looked terrified. Then she looked at Nate. Nate nodded. Just once. It meant whatever you do, I am with you. Abby closed her eyes. She remembered the cellar, the smell of dirt and copper. She remembered the sheer terror that had seized her vocal cords and squeezed them until they died. But then she remembered the porch in the rain. She remembered Nate Setz reading her own words back to him. She remembered the warmth of this family. She wasn't a scared 19-year-old girl hiding in the dirt anymore. She was a woman. She was a mother. She was a wife. This was her land. This was her family. And no one was going to take it from her. Abby opened her eyes. She took a slow, deep breath. The air filled her lungs. It felt like breathing fire. She pushed the air up, past her ribs, past her collarbone. She forced it into her throat. She threw her entire will against the iron door in her mind. The door cracked. Her lips parted. A sound came out. It was a terrible sound at first. A harsh, clicking gasp, like gears grinding without oil. The courtroom went dead silent. The defense attorney froze. Abby swallowed. It felt like swallowing ground glass. She forced her jaw to move. She forced her tongue to form the shape of the letters. The word was raspy, scraped raw, but it echoed in the high ceilings of the courthouse. Nate gripped the wooden railing so hard the wood groaned. He stopped breathing. Abby looked straight at the judge. Then she looked at the defense attorney. She didn't whisper. She pushed the words out, one by heavy one, earning every single syllable. I stayed silent. Abby's voice trembled, but she locked her jaw and kept pushing, because I was terrified of this world. The defense attorney opened his mouth to object, but the judge held up a sharp hand, silencing him instantly. Abby sat up straighter. The words were coming easier now. The rust was falling off the hinges. The voice that had been buried for 7 years was waking up, and it was furious. But the law cannot. Abby took a ragged breath, her voice gaining volume and steel. Use a victim's silence as an excuse to cover up a crime. She looked at Blackwood. The color drained from his face. "You think because I was broken, I am stupid," Abby said. Her voice wasn't just working now. It was ringing out, clear, defiant. "You think because I don't shout, I don't have rights." She pointed a shaking finger directly at Blackwood. "I am Abigail Thorne. I am here. I heard everything. I saw your forged seal, and I have the right to demand justice for my family." The silence in the courtroom was absolute. No one moved. No one coughed. The sheer power of her spoken words hung in the air like ringing bells. The judge stared at her. Slowly, he turned his head to the defense attorney. "Counsel," the judge said softly. "The witness is speaking. You may cross-examine." The defense attorney looked at Abby. He looked at the absolute, unflinching iron in her dark eyes. He looked down at his legal pad. He slowly shook his head. He sat down. "No questions, Your Honor." The gavel fell. Guilty. The trial was over. Blackwood was in chains. The afternoon sun was bleeding orange across the horizon as they walked out of the courthouse. The street was busy. Carriages rolling by, people talking. But for Nate and Abby, it felt like they were the only two people on earth. They stood on the stone steps. Nate looked at her. He didn't ask how she did it. He didn't treat her like a medical marvel. He reached out. He gently cupped the side of her face. His thumb brushed along her jawline. "Your voice," Nate whispered. His eyes were shining. "It's beautiful." Abby smiled. A real, wide, bright smile. She leaned into his hand. She opened her mouth. Her throat still ached, but the lock was gone forever. "Thank you," Abby said softly, "for listening when I didn't have one." Nate wrapped his arms around her, pulled her against his chest, and buried his face in her hair. Right there on the courthouse steps, in front of the whole town. Summer arrived in Montana. The mud dried. The prairie grass turned a brilliant golden green. The northern 800 acres were flush with sweet water. It was late evening. The sun was dipping behind the snow-capped peaks, casting long purple shadows across the yard. Abby sat on the porch. She was in the rocking chair. She didn't have a Winchester resting across her lap. The rifle was locked in a wooden cabinet inside the house, a relic of a war she had finally won. Instead, a thick leather-bound book rested on her knees. Clara sat on the wooden floorboards, right by Abby's feet, her chin resting on her hands, staring out at the sunset. Nate stood by the porch rail, leaning against the post. He was whittling a piece of soft pine with a pocket knife, just listening. Abby traced her finger under the printed words. She read aloud. Her voice wasn't raspy anymore. It was clear, melodic. It carried a soft, rhythmic cadence that drifted out over the quiet prairie. "And so," Abby read, her voice smooth and steady, "they walked out into the wide country. Not without fear, but without looking back." She closed the book. The heavy cover made a soft thump. Clara looked up. "Is that the end?" "No," Abby said softly, smiling down at her daughter. "That's just the end of the chapter. We start a new one tomorrow." Clara smiled. She scrambled up, kissed Abby's cheek, and ran inside the house as the first stars began to prick the evening sky. Nate closed his pocket knife. He walked over to the rocking chair. He looked at the empty prairie. He looked at the woman sitting in front of him, a woman who had arrived with nothing but a rifle and a broken soul. Now, she had a home. She had a voice. Nate reached down and took her hand. He pulled her gently to her feet. "Perfect," Nate whispered. And for the first time, Abby spoke the word right back to him. "Perfect."
As the sun sets over the Montana prairie and the wind settles in the canyons and valleys, we leave Abigail Prescott, Nate Thorne, and young Clara standing together, scarred, tested, yet unbroken. Their story is not just one of survival, but of the courage to face the truths we often hide from the world and even from ourselves. Abby teaches us that strength is not measured by the loudness of your voice, but by the steadiness of your actions. That silence can carry dignity, that scars can carry lessons, and that the right to protect oneself is as sacred as any law or tradition. Nate's journey reminds us that even the most hardened hearts can be softened by empathy and understanding, and that acknowledging your past, even the parts that haunt you, can finally release the weight you've carried for years. Clara shows us that innocence and courage coexist, and that children often see and understand more than we give them credit for. This story brings to light the profound power of connection, the quiet bonds between people, and the moral strength it takes to forgive, not for the sake of others, but for one's own freedom. It teaches that justice is not only in the law, but in protecting the vulnerable and standing against oppression, even when the world seems stacked against you. It reminds us that love, in all its forms, whether between a father and daughter, a couple bound by trust, or a surrogate mother guiding a child, has the power to heal the deepest wounds. As we close this chapter on the prairie, let us carry forward the lesson that survival is intertwined with humanity, that courage comes in many forms, and that telling the truth, even when it is difficult, can set us free. Life in the West was harsh, but it was never without meaning. It demanded resilience, honesty, and heart. May we all, in our own lives, find the bravery to face our ghosts, to protect those we love, and to act with integrity, even when the path is uncertain.